Hello and welcome to PS On Air, where writers from Project Syndicate meet the newspapers that publish them. I'm Anatol Kaletsky, and today we have with us Yannis Varoufakis, the former finance minister of Greece in the crucial period when it was negotiating with the IMF and the European Union, and now a co-founder of DiEM25. We also have David Alandete, managing editor of El País, and Torsten Rieker, international correspondent of Handelsblatt. As we're in London, I'd like to start off talking to you about Brexit and what, if anything, Britain can learn from the experience that Greece had in negotiating its conflictual relationship with the EU.
The main lesson is to avoid at all cost a negotiation for the right to negotiate, a right that would not be granted, with substantial costs on each side of the English Channel. And the way to avoid that is for the Prime Minister to make up her mind. Either withdraw from the negotiations, which I do not recommend because that would be seriously deleterious to the interests of the people of Britain and the interests of the people of Europe, or to make Mr. Barnier and his team redundant. And the only way to do this...
How do you do that?
Well, how about filing an application for a European Economic Area, Norway-style agreement, interim agreement that lasts, let's say, 5 years, which is equivalent of the term of the British Parliament, to kick off immediately after the end of the 2-year post-Article 50 triggering period. That way, firstly, Mrs. Merkel is going to relax because the problem shifts to the next Chancellor in 2024. Secondly, there is no issue about contributions to the EU budget, there is no issue about freedom of movement, there is no issue about European Court's jurisdiction in Britain. And actually, in a sense, this is the best way of serving the philosophical argument in favor of Brexit, the Burkean argument about the importance of restoring to the House of Commons full sovereignty, because this is the only way of making the House sovereign in the decision as to what the EU-UK relationship must be in the future. Suddenly, the heat goes away and some light may shine through.
That's very interesting, Yannis, because to some extent that is the policy on which some of the crucial parties in Britain are converging. To some extent, it's like the Labour Party policy, and Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, is also moving towards that direction. Torsten, how do you think that would be received in Germany if Britain turned around now and said, all right, we want to stay in a Norway-style arrangement for an extended period?
I think especially Chancellor Merkel would be happy to hear that, because this would actually postpone the day of reckoning a bit. It wouldn't probably change the final decision, because after 5 years you have to make a decision. It would be easier, I think, after 5 years than after 2 years. But on the other hand, I would like to turn the question around. So is there anything the Greek people can learn from the Brexit experience so far? Because it was quite a painful experience after the vote last year. And do you think there's any lesson for Greece here to learn?
There are lessons for all of us Europeans. But maybe the lesson you want to elicit from me with your question concerns how to conduct a negotiation when, unlike Britain, which is perfectly sustainable as a country, your own country is unsustainable, laboring under a quadruple insolvency, an insolvent state, insolvent banks, insolvent corporations, and insolvent households, right? My own view on this has always been the same, that when you have the weak bargaining position, you must never bluff and you must never issue threats, but you should state very clearly what your preference ordering is. This is something I tried to carry the government I served for along with me, but I failed. I didn't manage to convince the Greek Prime Minister.
David, would you like to come in on this point?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about how the Greek experience is an example now for people who are negotiating or are trying to negotiate here in the United Kingdom Your latest book is used here. I believe it's called Adults in the Room. It's used as a model of how to negotiate, as an example. But there's something there that I think maybe you can reflect on, which is how to explain to the people the trade-offs that are going to come, which are very difficult and are very tough. And it's my impression that we're not always clear in Greece.
Firstly, just for the purposes of disclosure, I was a Remain supporter. So because I thought that the costs, political, moral, economic, were great, much greater from leaving than from remaining, this is why. But now I think it's absolutely essential to understand that the calculus of cost and benefit, of trade-offs, as you put it, is not fixed. You know what the greatest mistake that everybody in Britain seems to be making, in my estimation? They all assume that the EU is a given. It's a fixed entity. It's like a club. It's a given club. And the question for the people of Britain is, do we want to belong to this club or not? This is a big mistake because the EU is work in progress. The EU cannot remain as it is. It is either it's going to disintegrate or it's going to reintegrate in a different way. Therefore, the purpose of my proposal for a 5-7 year transition period is not simply so that trade-offs can be worked out and the relationship can be worked out, but so that Britain and the EU transform themselves simultaneously with the hidden hope that in 2025 a different Britain is going to want to rejoin a democratized and reformed EU.
On monetary policy, you've recently written a very interesting article on Project Syndicate, which suggested that governments should get involved directly in the creation of money because central banks are no longer truly independent. You say, give governments a greater say in domestic money creation and indeed greater independence from the central bank by establishing a parallel payment system based on fiscal money, or more precisely, money backed by future taxes. But is this really all about, when it comes down to it, allowing governments to run bigger budget deficits? Is that really all it's about, or is there something else to it?
Not in the slightest. It's got nothing to do with bolstering the capacity, giving more degrees of freedom to government to run budget deficits. It's got to do with allowing governments greater degrees of freedom when it comes to liquidity. It's not the same thing. And let's face it, in the Eurozone, most of the money is created by private banks anyway. It's not created even by the central bank. The central bank creates a small amount of money which is then massively turbocharged by a financial sector that has had a very bad history of just going completely berserk. Mm-hmm. And at the very same time, when those banks go bankrupt, then you have this cynical shift of losses from their books onto the shoulders of taxpayers under conditions of austerity that reduce the incomes from which the states and the governments must repay the costs of saving the bankers. Mm-hmm. The idea about a parallel payment system in the Eurozone is meant, this is how I mean it, as a means of effectively strengthening the Eurozone, not disintegrating it. And I need to make this very clear. The very strict separation of two ideas. A parallel currency, which you introduce when you want to effectively move away from the euro, and a parallel payment system, which works as follows. I was planning to introduce this in Greece. It never came to being, but the idea was this. Firstly, in Greece we have a lot of arrears between private entities, individuals or companies, and between the state and private entities and private entities and the state. So imagine you use the web interface of the tax office under every tax file number to create a deposit account, and in that account to simply type the money that the state owes private actors.
So it does not create more credit, but it creates more liquidity.
Creates more liquidity. And then they can use it, they can keep this liquidity to repay future taxes in the future. And if they keep it for a year, then they get a discount, which is effectively allowing an interest rate on fiscal money, which is different from that of the central bank, that effectively offers tax relief to those who participate in the increases in the liquidity.
How do the politicians, the people in government, avoid the accusations that they are actually trying to control, the flow of money and control to influence over the central banks? Like, this would be politically toxic for many governments.
Well, firstly, notice that the system that I'm advocating is a closed system within a jurisdiction, like in Spain.
Okay.
So this system would only apply to taxpayers in Spain. So the liquidity that we would be creating, Spaniards would not be able to take out of the system and spend it on a BMW or a Mercedes-Benz. Yeah? It can only be spent amongst taxpayers in Spain. It's euro-denominated, it's not a different currency, but it's the kind of IOUs that can be exchanged only locally.
There's no control of the government over the central bank.
None at all.
Okay.
None at all. The government effectively bypasses, in a way, the money markets in a peer-to-peer relationship with citizens. But it's a closed system which does two things. Firstly, it makes the central bank's life easier because Mario Draghi no longer needs to bend his rules. Secondly, it makes any potential breakup of the Eurozone less painful.
Torsten, what do you think would be the reaction in Germany?
It would be awful, I have to say. I mean, I found it interesting from an academic point of view. But I mean, you have to think about how do you solve it politically. And as you said, this is a closed system. You need some kind of country to deal with in the first place. Otherwise, it's not going to show anything to anybody. As far as you touch the independence of the European Central Bank, or even tell people the state would be allowed to create some money, be it for liquidity reasons or whatever, it would be very hard to solve this politically in Germany.
How would you sell it?
Just one more thought. And I don't see the need, the urgency at the moment that we need some kind of safeguard mechanism for a breakup of the Eurozone.
Allow me to answer the 2 points you made. Firstly, how do you convince a people, not just the Germans, the Greeks, the French, about any idea? Through dialogue, through reasoned debate that bypasses prejudice. What you mentioned is a prejudice. We need to bypass it simply by asking our friends in Germany. By the way, not all Germans would respond this way. And one of the persons that I've been discussing this is a famous German economist, Thomas Mayer, who used to be chief economist at Deutsche Bank. We worked together on this idea. So it's, if you want it, as much a German idea as it is a Greek idea. Secondly, what would I say to my friends in Germany about this? Look, why would you object to a situation where, when the Greek state owes a Greek pharmaceutical company €1 million and doesn't have the liquidity to give it, instead of going cap in hand to Draghi and asking him to bend his rules to create that $1 million, which is what he's doing now, effectively he gives an IOU. The Greek state gives an IOU to the Greek pharmaceutical company, which is electronic, through the tax system web phase. And then that pharmaceutical company, if it owes, say, 500,000 to a supplier, can pass this IOU to a Greek supplier, who can then pay workers, who can then go to the supermarket and buy stuff. Why does this interfere with central bank independence, and why is this a problem for Germany? It's actually good for Germany to do this. This is my answer to that. On the second question, I can see your point that over the last few months there has been a great deal of celebration in Europe that the crisis is over. The crisis is not over. I'm experiencing a deja vu feeling. It is like 2002. Remember, about a year after the dot-com bubble burst, when loose money made people feel, and commentators, and some very clever commentators, that, oh, false alarm, it's all fantastic. And that was what spearheaded, under the surface, the stretching out of all the imbalances that led us to 2008. I believe that Europe is now being threatened by this form of complacency, by the false sense of having overcome the crisis.
I agree that the crisis isn't over yet. But if you look at the numbers, growth numbers, I just did before our conversation here, they are going up. If you look unemployment, they are going down. So it's not just a feeling.
Well, Europe is becoming a place where the numbers are prospering and the people are suffering. And this is also, for me, this is even worse, because you see, it allows our political class to be more complacent. Yes, unemployment is falling, but the quality of good jobs is also falling. Precariousness is rising. Inequality is becoming toxic. This is only going to give rise to right-wing populism and xenophobia.
That's all we have time for. Yannis Varoufakis, Torsten Rieker, David Aldente, thank you very much for coming to London for this event, and thank you for watching PS On Air.